Today we are going to talk with Dr. Sia Van Sheldon and Dr. Bill Turnley about bandwidth recovery. I'll start with the introductions. Dr. Sia Van Sheldon is the author of two books, Bandwidth Recovery and Bandwidth Recovery for Schools. She is the Special Projects Advisor for the integration of academic and student affairs at the Association of American Colleges and Universities. She recently retired as Vice President for Academic and Student Affairs at Malcolm X College, one of the city colleges of Chicago. From 2012 to 2018, she was the Executive Director of Institutional Assessment at University of Central Oklahoma, where she also taught in sociology. From 2009 to 2012, she was the Vice President for Academic Affairs at Highland Community College here in Kansas, and she was on the faculty at Kansas State University from 1989 to 2008. On the social work faculty for 11 years, Director of Women's Studies, and then Director of Assessment. Dr. Van Sheldon has a Bachelor's Science in Psychology from K-State, a Master's of Social Work from the University of Connecticut, and an Ed.D. from Harvard University. Many of you will also know Dr. Bill Turnley from our Management 820 Managing Organizational Behavior course. Dr. Turnley is the department head for the Department of Management within the College of Business here at Kansas State University. He conducts research in the areas of organizational behavior, human resource management, and business ethics. His primary areas of interest include psychological contracts and employment relationships, organizational citizenship behavior, and other pro-social employee behaviors, impression management, and reducing unethical behaviors. So I am going to actually turn it over now to Dr. Van Sheldon and Dr. Turnley to talk to us about bandwidth recovery.
Hey, Sarah, can you go back to the slide before this?
Yes, I can.
Because my name somehow became Van Sheldon, but it's really Verschleden, which is
oh my goodness,
appropriate on the first one. So I'm open to things.
Guys, that actually is probably my fault because I believe through emails I have changed your name a few times.
I love it. I love it.
I am so sorry.
It doesn't matter. It's Belgian, and so Van Sheldon actually probably is a thing in Belgium, so it's all right. But anyway, this is actually my real name.
Thank you for correcting me. I appreciate it.
That's okay.
I am going to stop sharing my screen, Dr. Sheldon, and allow you to take over.
Okay.
And I don't have a correction. That was an actual picture. But I probably should note that it has to be incredibly old because I haven't worn a tie at work in well over a decade. So just put that out there.
Yes, I think, Bill, maybe you should update that picture. This looks more like you right here, I'm sure. Okay, and now I didn't realize I would love, and Bill, actually, you're in charge, so I'm just going to shut up.
No, you're fine. Go ahead with whatever you'd like, Sia.
Well, since we have a small group, which is delightful, actually, because it's more like we can have a seminar. If people want to put their cameras on and we can have it, more be all here in the room, it's fine, no pressure. But if you want to, you'd be welcome to, even though this is a webinar officially, it looks like people are here. So feel free to put your camera on if you want, and we can be here together.
And I think my intention for this is basically to try to stay out of the way and let us benefit from having Sia here. A lot of you guys either have had me in class or will have me in class, and so we'll have a chance to talk through some of the areas that I look at, and we will even in this talk through how that relates to a lot of Sia's work. But I think what we'd like to do is just take advantage of our chance to have her with us today. And so I'm basically just going to act as a moderator a little bit and ask her a series of questions, and then either you guys or I or Deborah, Sarah, any of us can chime in. I think as we have questions, I'm sure Sia will be happy to answer those. So just to get us going, Sia, if you'd tell us a little bit about your definition of bandwidth, and then I think we probably all, after hearing about that, will understand that it's always been important. but why is it particularly important for us to have this conversation now?
Yeah, very good. That was a good frame. So yes, I have for the last, as Sarah so kindly introduced me, I was on the faculty at K-State for many years in social work, then in women's studies. So I've been working on what we might call equity issues for all of my career. My master's is in social work and in big picture social work, social welfare policy, social welfare history, not clinical social work. So I've been looking at these things for a long time. And so let me tell you about bandwidth and what that means. But I want to say two other things first. One is I want to emphasize that my work is about big picture things. So, and I'm going to make an assertion here, and we can talk about this later. So make notes that you want to challenge me if you want on this. But I think from my professional life in teaching social welfare history and other kind of histories, that we foundationally in the United States from the beginning, there's racism, there's classism, there's homophobia, there's religious intolerance, there's all those things. And I'm not saying the United States is unique in this way. This is kind of human nature, I think. Well, I hate that. I'll take that back about human nature, but it seems to be when large numbers of people get together, these differentisms, as I call them, come out. So and so my work is about the effect of those differentisms on us and on students. So what I'm trying to distinguish here is I'm not talking about each of our individual behaviors and the effects of our behaviors. Although, of course, we all want to be aware of our behaviors, and we want to make people feel welcome, and we want to watch what we say and do to make sure it's not hurtful to somebody. But what I'm talking about in bandwidth is the effect of these big things on all of us. That's one thing. The second thing I want to talk about is really fundamental to this discussion is multitasking. And we know, probably, I don't know, you probably all know now because it's been discussed out there, that multitasking is not a thing. Our brains don't multitask. We do one thing at a time. Now, especially, I don't know about you all, during the pandemic, I feel like just about every moment I'm multitasking. And those of you who are working, have small children at home, maybe caring for other people in your family, looking after your own health, don't you feel like you're always multitasking because you're trying to do all these things, keep all these balls in the air? But our brain doesn't multitask. It focuses on one thing, then it switches, it focuses on another thing. And the reason I'm saying that is, if we are in a situation where we don't feel safe, we don't feel like we belong, we don't feel respected, we don't feel there's something we're worried about money, we're fearful in some way in our setting, that part of our brain that is worried and fearful about those things is not available for us to do our work, for our students to learn. That's why I emphasize the multitasking thing. So even though we feel like we do it, our brains really don't do it. So bandwidth. I read a book several years ago called Scarcity. It was written by a professor at Harvard and one at Princeton. And they were writing about scarcity of money. So they wrote about poverty. And they said in this country and others, but they was focusing in the United States, in this country, we mostly blame people for being poor. We say they're poor because they make bad choices. And these two men, professors, said, yes, people who are poor sometimes make bad decisions, but it's because they're poor, because their cognitive capacity is, a lot of it's taken up by worrying about money. And so, yes, when they are in a situation where there's a decision, sometimes they do make a less than effective decision. But they kind of flipped it on its head. Instead of blaming people, you're poor because you make bad choices, they're saying you make bad choices because you're poor. So the message of that book was scarcity steals cognitive capacity. And they call that bandwidth. So I borrowed that bandwidth. So then I thought, and by this time I'd been teaching at K-State for 25 years or something. And I thought all the other kinds of scarcity among our students, scarcity of respect, of safety, of belonging, of dignity, of visibility for some of our students. And I thought, could those kinds of scarcity explain why, for instance, economically secure white students do better than students in almost any other group in higher ed across the whole country? Because maybe they're coming in class with all their bandwidth. So bandwidth is, and if we were together, I'd hand out these little slips of paper. This is my vision of bandwidth. And if because of this fogginess in the back, it kind of fogs out, but it's about the width of my head. So I think of my bandwidth is about this much. And bandwidth is our cognitive capacity that's available to us. So when we're right here at this moment, our brains are doing 11 million bits of activity per second, 11 million, because our brains are almost all on automatic, pumping our blood, telling our lungs to breathe, digesting our food. We have conscious control over fewer than 100 of those 11 million bits of activity, fewer than 100. And that's what I'm calling bandwidth. So this is our bandwidth. If you had all your bandwidth, and if you notice on this, there are solid lines on the sides of this, because bandwidth is a finite resource. We have this much and that's it. And this bandwidth has to be for working, for learning, for taking care of our families, for taking care of ourselves. Everything has to come out of that bandwidth. So back to the book on scarcity. If this much of your bandwidth is you're worried about money all the time, which you do if you're really poor, you have the other half to do everything else. And so, and if these things like not feeling like you belong, not feeling safe, feeling like you're not, the imposter syndrome, I don't know if you've heard that, you feel like you don't quite fit in at your work or in your community, part of your brain is ruminating, which means these thoughts are going around and around. Will I be safe? Will I be loved? Will I be treated fairly? Will I be able to succeed in this job, class, community? And that churning of those questions takes up your part of your bandwidth, and that's not available for everything else that you need to do in your life. So that's been my work. So there are various things, and my work has been focused on students, but it applies to all of us. And I'm getting more and more questions about, well, what about us, workers, colleges and universities, just people in general? What is the effect of bandwidth depletion on our ability to be successful at work, in our communities and our families? So that's kind of the basis of what I've been doing the last few years.
And in your perception, is bandwidth at our capacity reduced now primarily due to COVID, because of other things going on in the world? Are we just paying more attention and it's not any lower than it was in the past? Where do you see us in that regard right now?
Okay, thanks for asking that question. And the answer to that is I feel like we're much more depleted now because of the pandemic, because of the social unrest around racial, violence toward racial Black people by police. I mean, right now, what's going on in Russia, if you're following the news? When we got out of Afghanistan, I feel like then the uncertainty spiked. Uncertainty is the undergirds all of these bandwidth depleters. So, but I want to make a point about that with the pandemic and these other things. So uncertainty depletes bandwidth, whether the uncertainty comes from you don't feel like you belong, or you have experienced racism or classism or sexism or homophobia, any of those things, or you've moved to a new community that is, I lived in a community once that if you didn't live there for 50 years, you just weren't part of the community. And I grew up in a town of 1,500 people. So I kind of know rural Kansas a little bit. And it was so true that I really never felt like I belonged there, even though I invested myself in the community. So that uncertainty, that feeling like you can't just kind of put down roots and be there. But uncertainty, so the pandemic increased uncertainty for all of us, right? Or across the whole world. But it wasn't evenly distributed, the uncertainty. So when the pandemic started, I was in Chicago, vice president at Malcolm X College, which is on the west side of Chicago. I lived in the northwest side of Chicago near the airport. And I rode on a train 45 minutes every day to my office. And I remember the day the president said, we're going to start working from home, March 16th. Because the day he said that, my certainty, my bandwidth expanded. because I was riding on that train every day with thousands of other people packed into the train, everyone breathing, and I knew I was going to get COVID. So when he said to stay at home, oh my gosh, my uncertainty just calmed down, because I lived in a little condo by myself, no kids at home, no anybody to take care of, in a safe neighborhood. I could walk for miles, which I did to get exercise. I kept my job, which was well paid. I could do my job fine from home. My colleagues, so 95% of the students, and not that high, but way over half of the faculty and staff at Malcolm X are Black and brown people. Many of them went home to overcrowded apartments where people generally worked all day and went out to not enough computing power, not enough laptops, not a safe neighborhood where they could walk. Many of them lost their jobs in the service sector. Many of them kept their jobs in healthcare, which was dangerous. So the uncertainty was not evenly distributed. And you could say that about the Black Lives Matter movement. All of us were probably concerned. Things just blew up. So much, cities were actually burning. But was the uncertainty and the bandwidth depletion equal between me and my Black colleagues? I don't think so. So uncertainty undergirds all these things. And so the pandemic, I don't know, I feel like in the pandemic, there's a piece of my bandwidth that's just not there pretty much every day. My mother is 91, worry about her. We all have our work. So yes, and Bill, the thing I want to point out about that I think is one of the things that I hope some of us will remember, is that as my identity is as a highly educated, economically secure, straight white person, and I'm feeling depleted during the pandemic. And if I can remember, this is what some people feel like every day, because they're Black or brown, or they have a disability, or they're LGBTQ in places where that's not safe, and many other things. They're poor, they're undereducated, they're underemployed. And those things are no more their fault than the pandemic is my fault. So I'm hoping that I, speaking for myself, can remember what this feels like. That I just don't quite have I know that my cognitive capacity is depleted, my bandwidth is depleted. And if I can remember that, it's going to make me more compassionate post-pandemic to people in many other identity groups for whom this is their reality. And what we can do, my emphasis of my work has been on how can we create learning environments and work environments where more of us can regain the mental bandwidth that we lose from these big societal things in the spaces over which we have control, which are small for most of us. We control a little bit, right? Maybe in our office, in our workspace. What do we do to make everybody feel like they belong? To cut down on microaggressions and other things that take away other people's bandwidth.
I think that's a great point, because I think some people would hear the idea that bandwidth and the theft of bandwidth is not equally distributed, and somebody like me might say, I'm a white male heterosexual who's in a secure job, so she's not really talking to me. Right. And the reality is both that all of us experience different things that steal our bandwidth. And so we have a personal investment. And then beyond that, just as a decent human being, we care because these things affect people that we are concerned about and people that we work with and have an obligation to. So I think that context is really important for all of us. Specifically within the workplace, if we have a pretty good understanding of all the challenges, some of the challenges, there are many more that you mentioned going on in the world. But when we think about the world of work, what are some of the major bandwidth stealers that occur in the workplace?
Okay, well, some of them are just the same as lots of writing I've done about students. Racism, classism, the isms, and some of the isms in workspace are, you didn't, and my work over, I'm just going to talk about my time in higher ed, but it could be anywhere. So in higher ed, one thing would be if you didn't take the same path as somebody else did to get to your job. So for instance, an administrator who, like typically you're a faculty person, you're department chair, then you're the dean, then maybe you're the provost. Well, maybe the provost came up through student affairs or some other, or a president came up through student affairs. You didn't have the same path. Well, then people at work might look at you and say, oh, you know, you're not the real deal, you know, because you came through this or that. People who get in certain businesses, like maybe agribusiness, many people have a path. They went to an ag school, they went here, they did this, they worked it, and they came into their position. Well, some people have a different path, but there will probably be some people at that workplace that look on that person as, ugh, you know, you didn't come on the same path. So that's one of the things. And then any other of the differentisms. So small town versus city. Maybe some people think, you know, I grew up downwind from the pig farm. So I feel like I didn't grow up on a farm, but I have kind of that rural knowledge kind of feel. If you grow up in a city and now you're in a agricultural business, maybe people think, eh. So that people with, I don't know if you know the term neurodiversity, which has become a more of a term. So people who may be on the autism spectrum or have some kind of different way to look at the world. And I think we're finally learning it's just different. It doesn't need to be bad. One is better than the other. It's just different. And actually, one of the things I wanted to say about I think we can remember at work is diversity of perspective and the way our minds work and the way we look at things. That is such an asset. If I'm on a work team, and probably I suspect everybody in your program is on some kind of work team. Very few of us anymore work in by ourselves all day. If you want to solve a problem and you have a team of 6 people who look like you, have the same background as you, have the same life experience and perspective as you might as well just have you, because you don't have that you want people who think in really different ways, who have really different backgrounds, because then you bring all these perspectives and you'll solve that problem. Because somebody else is going to go, but what about this? So diversity is power on a work team. So we want to embrace that instead of saying, yeah, you're kind of different. You didn't come through the same ag program, or you didn't come through the same business program, whatever. That is such a huge asset to have that kind of diversity. So, so work. So you said I was talking about things that rob people at work, the same as every place else. So neurodiversity, somebody who's not accepted as much because they kind of weird. I mean, we think it was kind of weird to have a different social skills, and sometimes, of course, often we know those people are geniuses over history when you look back at who was maybe what we would now call on the spectrum, that they just are different. So lots of things, just, I guess, differentisms.
So in talking about bandwidth, is it things that there's some aspects of it that are things that a manager can directly address, hopefully, to foster a climate of diversity and put an end as much as we can to racism and sexism and
Yes.
other isms.
Yes.
But there's always going to be, unless I'm misunderstanding, there's always going to be a part that we just can't control. Bandwidth gets stolen because we hit a family emergency. We have a family member who gets sick or ill, or you're going through a rough personal time, or you're concerned that you're in the wrong career. And correct me if I'm wrong, but those they have a different cause, but they affect our bandwidth similarly. I think maybe sort of approaching it 2 ways. One, what are some of the key things that either at a macro level an organization can do, or at more of an individual level, a specific manager, anybody with managerial responsibilities? What are some of the things that they can do? And maybe we can talk about that first, and then step aside and say, for those things that aren't caused by an organization or by these isms, but that are just our personal, maybe then we can flip in a few minutes to talking about what individuals can do to recover bandwidth. But
Yes.
we start with either at the macro level, an organization, or what a specific supervisor, manager, administrator could do.
Yep. Yeah. And I just was looking down, making a couple notes so I don't forget something, but I want to emphasize again, the things that steal bandwidth for people in certain identity groups happen out because of societal things, nothing to do with what we're doing inside our organizations. So, and just this example comes to mind. I was talking to the president of Malcolm X College, and we were just talking about bandwidth and our students. And I don't know if any of you know Chicago. The west side of Chicago is a pretty rough area historically, as is the south side, and many of our students come from there. So he was just posing, if somebody rides the bus for an hour to get to Malcolm X and they're a Black person and they are worried the whole time they're going to get shot because there's gang stuff going on, how much bandwidth do you think they have when they walk into the classroom? This has nothing to do with the teacher, the building, gorgeous building, I think it's quite safe. So that's much of what steals our bandwidth is out of our control. So we don't need to take that on as, I should be doing something about that. But your question, so my emphasis has been, what can we do in our spaces over which we have a little control to help that, in that case, how can we, when that student walks in the door of Malcolm X College and into my classroom, what can I do in my classroom while they're there for that hour to help that student recover some bandwidth that they lost when they're fearful or insecure? So what can we do at work? Let me talk about a concept called identity safety. And identity safety, Claude Steele, who is a professor at Stanford, who named this thing called stereotype threat. And I'll just say quickly what that is. So stereotype threat is when you are a member of a group about whom there's a negative stereotype. And remember some of the things I've already talked about. That doesn't mean you're Black or brown. It could be whatever is a negative stereotype in your, let's say, your work area. So maybe some people perceive you came from the wrong place, or whatever it is. And you're in a situation, a performance situation, you're at work. So we can almost say all that counts, that matters. Well, your work matters. Part of your brain is worried, I'm going to do poorly. And then people are going to say, they're going to confirm that stereotype. They're going to say, see, I told you that person didn't have the same path as I did. And here they've screwed up. So, and this has been shown dozens of studies over 25 years, that ruminating about that threat of that stereotype threat actually makes you perform less well, because it's taken up some of your bandwidth that you can't then devote to your work, that task. So, and then Claude Steele talks about a broader thing called identity threat and identity safety. So an identity threat environment, let's say you work for a big company, you're in a big building and there's pictures on the walls of people historically and whatever. And what if there's not an image up there that has a person who looks like you? And this happens at colleges and universities, which is where most of my experience is. They have, in fact, the school I used to work with, I went around and took pictures in every building of the pictures. And even though the student body was 33% over 25, so what we call older learners, and even though more than half the students were not white, probably 90% of the pictures were of young white people, and certainly thin, attractive, apparently physically able white people. Well, that can be an identity threat for people who may be Black or brown, or who use a wheelchair, or who are 50 years old coming back to school. I don't see myself. So one thing you can do at work really easily, this is probably the cheapest and easiest thing to do to create identity safety, is walk around your buildings. Are the pictures of the people reflect the employees who are working there now? I think at universities, many times they reflect the people who were there 50 years ago when they put some pictures up, or sometimes people have suggested they're the pictures of the students we'd really like to have, but they're not the pictures of the students we do have. So an easy thing is to go around your workplace and make sure you have pictures that reflect the identities of the people who are there now. That's just such an easy thing. There are others, and so identity safety is about feeling like you belong, and not belonging is one of the hugest bandwidth stealers. And one of the things you can look at your work setting as well is everybody safe and feel like they belong in all their identities? Remember, I grew up in Kansas, so I know sort of the environment here, and I know many of your students in this program are from other places, so it's context specific. But if you're lesbian, gay, trans, and you don't feel safe at work being that, anytime you're hiding something about your identity, that takes up bandwidth. On the best days, you're down 25% because you're worried somebody's going to find out. And it could be 100 things. It could be that you have a mental illness. It could be that your father's in prison. It could be that you grew up really poor and you don't want people to know. It could be that you have childhood trauma. You were abused or neglected or something, and childhood trauma lives with us in our body. Could be that you have a chronic illness. Anything that and this doesn't mean we all have to come into our workplaces and spill all our stuff to everybody. No, doesn't mean that. But what it does mean, I think, is that you need to feel like if people found out, if people knew I was a lesbian, or I grew up really poor, or I have a mental illness, or whatever, that it would be okay. That's what's important. And many work environments, well, I know there's lots of research out there that childhood trauma, people don't talk about it. And it just stays inside you. And that also, and we know it's widespread. So we're also better off, again, not just talking about it all the time, but if we did talk about it, we'd find out we have lots of company, unfortunately. We're not the only one. We all, I think, sit and think, I'm the only one who had a childhood like this. Everybody else's family was normal and good. And it isn't, unfortunately. And once we find out, when I talk with lots of groups of students at universities, there's this kind of relief that, oh my gosh, I'm not the only one. I don't need to carry this burden by myself. And that's a big relief. So, and then one more thing about, actually, this comes out of the childhood trauma literature, but thinking of people's performance and behavior with a bandwidth kind of perspective, what it has done for me is changed the way I view somebody, changed the question I ask from what's wrong with you, why aren't you performing to whatever, to what happened to you, or what is happening? And it just changes the conversation. So when at the University of Central Oklahoma, I had two brilliant young women who reported to me they were data people, and one of them had two little boys. And if she seemed not on her game, virtually every time it's because one of the kids was sick or something was going on. And I could gripe at her, why didn't you have that to me, or whatever. Or I can say, hey, what's happening? And every time it was a bandwidth issue. So, my oldest boy is really sick. So yes, she was at work, but half her bandwidth is so worried about her baby. So she's not at the top of her game. And so then what do I say to her? Well, how can I uplift you today? Because your bandwidth's low. And what a nicer way to be with people, because it often was me the next day. My bandwidth was low because something was going on with one of my kids or my grandkids or whatever. And what a nicer, just compassionate way to be in the world, to say, hey, what's happening? And then have a discussion. And just psychologists will tell you, just articulating, I'm really worried about my mom, or I'm really worried about this. That kind of takes it off my chest. If somebody then says, oh gosh, yeah, that sound, give me a pat on the back, literally or figuratively, say, oh, okay, I'm here for you. Let me know how I can help. That just recovers a bit of bandwidth, just knowing that instead of judging me or criticizing me, you're saying, hey, let me know if I can help. I understand that is huge. So in a you can transform a work environment just by a new frame to look at the bandwidth thing.
So maybe one more question, and then I want to make sure we have time for people to ask questions and those kind of things. So suppose we're in an organization, and maybe it's not a hostile organization, and we don't feel like people are out to get us, but it just seems to be somewhat indifferent to our bandwidth. What can we as individuals do if it's not going to be if we don't have a supervisor who's going to ask us, how are you doing today, when we're down? What can we as individuals do to try to recover this bandwidth?
Our own.
Yeah,
that's a really good question. And I think it just helps to know have this frame. So one of the things the director of the counseling center at University of Central Oklahoma had an analogy she used. Anyway, I think it's very similar. She talked about a jar of marbles, that everybody has our jar of marbles. And as people come and ask us for help and we're helping somebody else at work, people are taking those marbles out because we're serving them. And she had 2 teenage kids at home at the time, and she'd say, and they're all teenage kids, they need stuff. And at some point she'd say, I'm out of marbles. You all have taken all my marbles. So I can't help anybody until somebody refills my marble jar. So when we recognize, but it took her to recognize I'm out of marbles. So the same thing I find on bandwidth, and I've had colleagues put a little bandwidth strip on their door and kind of mark it. If we can just say to people, hey, my bandwidth is really low today. So I'm going to, and you can tell people that, but also I think just some of the normal things that help us recover and calm down. When I recognize my bandwidth is depleted, what can I do? Well, get up and walk around the building. I mean, there's lots of scientific evidence about the effect of exercise on your brain. Put whatever down, take a break and do another task. There are things we can do to recover. Look at our own work-life balance. Of course, that's easy to say and not so easy to do. But sometimes we need to, and Bill, I know you framed it in, if your supervisor is not particularly sympathetic to this thing, that's a different thing, but just your own self, deep breathing, some of the things on mindfulness that right at your own desk, close your eyes, deep breath in, deep breath out a few times. So we can pay attention to our bandwidth. But Bill, what I have found out is people have told me once they understand, like when I talk to students about all the new nursing students at Malcolm X, which I talk to every semester, the cohort, who are mostly Black and brown students, there's often tears because people realize, oh, this isn't my failing. People who look like me, share this identity with me, are going through this. This is a feeling we all have. And I feel depleted. And just that is bandwidth expanding, because it's no longer blaming and shaming me. So at work, if I have kids at home and I have my mom's sick and all this stuff, then we can say, oh, that's why I'm feeling so depleted. I'm not a failure. I'm a normal person who anybody in my situation would have depleted bandwidth. So some of it's just self-understanding, and then give yourself a break and do some of the just simple kinds of things that can recover. And hopefully, I have some faith in people left, that if we have these conversations that at workplaces, maybe we can get more people to kind of engage in the conversation and realize, the workplace will be way, 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 way better for everyone if we acknowledge these bandwidth things and created workspaces where people could recover their bandwidth, even if it means I'm going to take 15 minutes and walk around the building. We're better off in the end, right? We all are. And it's such a nicer way to work. It's a nicer way to live for everybody.
And I think that's really important. Obviously, for those of us like in an org behavior sphere where we talk about what's going on today in the workplace, with whether you call it the big quit or the great resignation or the great renegotiation. I mean, it goes by a lot of different labels, but obviously that's coming from much of it is coming from a place of that just not being happy and fulfilled and engaged
Yep.
at work, and
Yep.
looking for other opportunities. And this COVID and the pandemic and the move to remote being something that primes people to rethink what they want to do with their careers and how they want to live their lives and where they want to live. So that's a big part of what we talk about in organizational behavior, and many of the same things that companies would do to try to create a more motivating and engaging and fulfilling workplace will go hand in hand with what you're talking about at the individual bandwidth level. So with those things in mind, why don't we throw it open for any questions, comments, input that any of our participants have, and see what's on people's minds.
Okay, and Deborah, I wasn't meaning to ignore your hand, so go ahead if you.
Oh, it's fine. I think I was just thinking through, and I think you addressed it a little bit more. I've been thinking through how do you make that transition from, if you're in an organization where, I mean, clearly we all come to work with goals, and we've got a bottom line that we have to meet. So as a supervisor navigating we've got a job we've got to get done, and how do I balance that with making sure that I'm controlling what's in my four walls and creating a space where my team can have as much bandwidth as possible. But bigger picture, I run into a culture that maybe isn't bandwidth friendly to begin with. That's the nature of the business. I mean, we were lean going into COVID. That was our thing. And now we're not backfilling those positions with the Great Resignation. It's a lot as a manager to try to navigate. So, but I think you kind of spoke to that a little bit.
Well, and the thing, and I'm glad I'm not in this situation, because it's got to be and I know friends who can't get employees, and still, like you say, Deborah, you have to get the job done. I do believe and have observed, if you have this perspective that supports people's bandwidth, you will get more done in the end. It feels counterintuitive because it might involve like taking a 15-minute break, which feels like non-productive time, but it pays off. It's like, I will compare it to doing check-ins with students at the beginning of classes, spending 5 to 7 minutes just going around the class or in small groups saying, how you doing? So students can say, I'm worried about my grandma, or, whatever. And some faculty, not so much anymore, but some faculty say, I don't have time for that. I need to cover all this material in the 50 minutes. But I think, I know many, many faculty have found out, if you don't spend that 5 to 7 minutes, you can spend the 43 minutes that's left, or you can spend the whole time. But if students' bandwidth is half gone, they're not learning anyway. And that's the same at a workplace. If you do not do these nurturing, bandwidth expanding things, you're not going to get the productive. People are running at half bandwidth. They're not as productive. So you not only have staff shortages, but the staff you have are working at half efficiency. But if you can do a few things, it's just amazing the small things that you can do to make identity safe environments and affirming environments that will make the people you have way more productive with, I would argue, not very much effort. It's kind of a change of disposition and attitude that then people want to work harder and they want to do better. That it sounds, anyway, I think it's true, even though it sounds too good to be true.
If I had bandwidth, I would love to see, I love a lean organization. I get it. It makes sense from an optimization perspective, but I'm also wondering how much of that practice hasn't created some of the Great Resignation by its very nature. And I would love to see some economic data and some studies on that. I'm sure someone with far more bandwidth than I is working on that right now.
There is probably data out there. Another equivalent of at colleges, some real intense colleges or departments or programs within universities, the culture has been, if you're not stressed out as a student, you're not good enough. you stay up all night, you are constantly stressed, you have no life for anything else, you're exhausted, you're probably not eating healthy. That's the measure of being a legitimately hardworking student. That's just not useful. I'm frozen. Are you hearing me?
We're hearing you
picture's
fine.
frozen.
Yeah, your picture's frozen, but
But you're
hear you
hearing me, so that's all right. So that's the equivalent of at work. I think some workplaces have that culture. If you're not stressed out, if you're not overworked, you're not working hard enough, when it's so counterproductive. I think we can. And the other thing, Bill, I want to say about the Great Resignation is I read something the other day that some of us grew up thinking we want our job to also, we over-identify with our job. So we want our job to also have meaning and fulfill our soul and our heart. And some people are saying, you know what? I'm realizing my job is a job. I have the job to pay my rent or my mortgage, to feed my kids, to do whatever I like to do, travel, and that's it. And I'm going to do my job and I'm going to do it well, but it's not me. And that is, and then some people conclude, this is an awful place. It's really detracting from me, and they leave. But some people have kind of, I think, reframed and said, I'm going to do this, but I'm going to do it in a little different way, kind of spiritually, soul, like soul level, that is not going to be my be all. And that changes it enough that, okay, I can do this for 8 hours a day. I can do this. And then I'm going to live my life otherwise.
Yeah, I think some of this is going to shake itself out. It's just going to take a long time. We've seen the specific industries maybe that laid people off quickest or sent people home the quickest during COVID, and then they're struggling. The ones where salaries were low and working conditions weren't great and employees weren't treated well. They're the ones that are really struggling to get people back now, because the COVID forced us to take a break, forced us to, a lot of us, to move and work from home, to rethink how we wanted our lives to be structured. And it made us more conscious about not just having inertia that kept us where we were. And I think some of that will shake out, Deborah, and that workplaces will have to adjust. It's not going to be quick, but it'll take time. And then you and I are in the same institution at K-State, and I think we understand, some of the budget constraints, and we want to do our best. I think one of the things any organization that's in a budget constrained environment and that needs to operate lean, and we understand why, we also at some point have to think about what we're willing to give up. And that's the hardest part, is that we want to do the same or sometimes even more with less. And at some point in a budget constrained environment, you have to decide, these are the things we can give up. We can't give up what's critical, but we're going to do a little bit less with less, even increasing efficiency.
Yeah, and the other thing that I encourage institutions and workplaces to do is, I think we're still doing a lot of processes and things, and asking our students and our employees to do a lot of process, filling out forms, just a lot of stuff that's obsolete as of, I don't know how many years ago. And I'm reminded every time I think about this, as going to the doctor's office and they hand you the clipboard and you write your name and address and phone number and birthday, 6 times? They know all that. They don't need me to write that even once, let alone 6 times. And there's I still think we're making students fill out forms. I bet at companies, there are forms and stuff that needs to be developed that does not need to be filled out. So one thing I think of relative to my students and anybody who reports to me is, anything I ask them to do, I ask, is this the way I want them spending their precious bandwidth? And if it's not, let's quit doing it. So I think in some ways we don't need to do less. We need to it is less, but we need to, not less good stuff.
Right.
Let's get rid of the stuff is so 20 years ago. We don't need to be doing this. And so look at every little thing in a company or in a department and say, do we still need to be doing this? Because it's taken up time that could be done to be creative and to be, healthier and more productive. just by examining all the little things that eat away over a day into our bandwidth and our time, which is not unrelated to bandwidth. Yeah.
Speaking of time, we're getting close
we are.
to the end. Any before we, and I'll turn it back over to Sarah at whatever point she gives me the signal. But any other questions from people before we close out?
Bill, I'd love to say, are you probably going to give me a chance to say a closing comment?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Because it just popped into my head. Many people, when I talk about this, many people who work with people who have various identities, they want to know, how can I be an ally? You know, I don't know what it's like to be a Black person, a gay person. You know, I don't know. I don't live in that skin or that identity. How can I be an ally? And I would encourage people to just realize when people might be stressed out. Like recently, well, it's been several months ago when the Asian women were shot in Atlanta. And my son, who's a graduate student, pointed out, you know, my Asian classmates and faculty might be kind of stressed out, which I thought I was very glad he noticed that. And so just saying to me, hey, how are you doing? You know, just noticing. You don't need to, it's not their responsibility to explain to you, but just if you see somebody who you think for whatever reason, whether it's something in the bigger news or whether it's, you know, their mom's sick or something, hey, how are you doing? And maybe they don't even need to articulate it, but things are so many simple things. So just be aware that some people under certain circumstances may have depleted bandwidth, and just make supportive noises. It can make a big difference. Yeah.
I know for me, thank you, Sia, for sharing all that information with us today. It's very helpful. I've made notes on several things you said, and even beyond just the general ideas, made notes on things that I need to do differently this week to try to help improve the bandwidth of some of my colleagues here in the department. And yep. You give me some good ideas on that. So I appreciate it very much.
Good. Sorry about my picture. I really am smiling and nodding, saying thank you.
Luckily it froze on a good shot. Most of the time it freezes.
Yeah, I know. It's not terrible.
That's a pretty good one to freeze on. Sarah, do you want to wrap us up?
Much. And thanks, Sarah and Deborah, for setting this up and facilitating.
You are both very welcome. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen once again. I just have a few slides here. Maybe. Okay, so for anyone that you know that might be interested in pursuing the MAB or just wants to take some time to share perspective with our staff, feel free to schedule an advising appointment with Deborah. Here on our MAB.ksu.edu page, you're going to see on the left, schedule an advising appointment, and that will take you to her calendar, and you can reserve some time to meet with Deborah. Next, we have several webinars happening over the next 2 months. We have our March 8th information webinar for prospective students. Feel free to let your colleagues know about our program. This is a great time to meet with our staff again in a group setting where we explain the program. March 22nd, we will have a webinar with Jack Reeder from Verizon Enterprise Solutions. He is a specialist in cybersecurity. And then on April 12th, we'll have another information webinar for prospective students. And April 26th, we will have a individual course offerings webinar with Dr. Shanoyan and Mr. Paul Cassidy. So that is what we have moving forward. And then lastly, we are on social media, so feel free to connect with the Kansas State University Master of Agribusiness on our Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out to us. We can share these types of events or information that pertains to agribusiness in a broader spectrum with students and prospective students. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Dr. Verschleden and Dr. Turnley. It was a pleasure having you today. I know I learned a lot and took many notes, so we really appreciate you taking your time today to join us. That concludes our webinar today. We're going to stop recording, but I'll stay on for a few minutes if anyone has any questions or anything they'd like to share.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you all. Thank you, Sia.
Mm-hmm.